My name is Kevin Delaney. I'm editor-in-chief of Quartz, which is a sister news organization to The Atlantic. It was started last year, focuses on global business news, and it's online at qz.com. So I encourage you to check that out. The panel this afternoon is the cyber threat to America's economy, infrastructure, and security. We have two excellent, well-placed people to address some of the key topics in this really, really important subject. I'll start with Vice Admiral Mike McConnell, Vice Chairman of Booz Allen Hamilton. He leads its cyber business. From 2007 to 2009, he was the U.S. Director of National Intelligence. Earlier in the 90s, he served a tour as head of the NSA, and at Booz Allen, you head their cyber business and focus on areas like cybersecurity, counterterrorism, things like that. Governor Tim Pawlenty. He is the president and CEO of the Financial Services Roundtable, and has been since last November, I think, which represents the financial services companies in issues like cybersecurity. And many of you may also know him as the governor of Minnesota from 2003 to 2011. So I'm going to start our discussion. We'll focus on two broad areas. One is the state of cybersecurity, and the second one is some of the possible solutions and the ways that we're addressing this currently. But I want to start with a question that a colleague of mine, Jay Lauf, asked at a dinner here 2 nights ago. And he said, his question was very simple. It was, is the magnitude of the cyber threats against the US so great that I should lay awake at night out of anxiety that something really, really bad is about to happen? So I want to start by putting that question to you. Vice Admiral, do you want to take that first?
Yes.
Okay. He should, I'll relay that to Jay.
Okay. This is a complex subject that can be very esoteric. And so let me do it at a summary level and just sort of make some bold assertions. And then maybe as we go through, I can defend those assertions, or they can be challenged or whatever. All right. At a strategic level, the United States is at strategic risk today. Strategic risk. Now, what do I mean by that? First of all, let me use the term cyber warfare. There are nation states building capability that could attack the critical infrastructures of the nation and destroy them. Now, what are those critical infrastructures? Banking, electric power, telecommunications, transportation. So at a level of warfare, there's strategic risk. Now, we deter them, and they deter us. So at some level, it's a little bit like comparing nuclear weapons. Now, here's the issue and the problem, and there are two things I'm going to say. As these nation states build these very inexpensive tools, they build lots of them. So how long is it going to be before someone on the inside, either disgruntled or looking to make money, or it somehow inadvertently leaks some of these tools, and now they're in the hands of someone who would not be deterred? Can you imagine a terrorist group or an extremist group out there that wants to change the world order? And there are lots of examples. We can go to that later if you want. Now, the third level of threat, and this is what very, very few people think about. The United States and a few of our closest allies, we have a policy that we conduct intelligence operations against military capabilities, political intentions, things that we would look at threats to the United States that would be important for us to understand. As a policy, we do not do economic espionage. Most nations in the world are very actively engaged in economic espionage. So here's what's going on today. We can get into details later. But there isn't a corporation or an institution in government, the private sector, the Congress, or anyone else that has not been penetrated by an adversary for which they have command and control privileges, which they're bleeding out information. So think in terms of intellectual property, source code, business plan, innovation, research and development. We are being bled of our intellectual capital, and if that's left unchecked for 10 years, I think that would have strategic implications for the United States.
And so just to underscore what you're saying every organization in the United States of significant size or importance has been compromised,
on a cyber level. That's correct.
Okay.
If you look into the computer system and you have a skill set that allows you to identify malware, and I have a team that does that, and there are others that do it. We have never examined a computer server farm or computer system of consequence that we don't find embedded malware that was placed there for the purpose of bleeding out intellectual capital. Now, in a warfare sense, that same malware is put there so that if we were mad at each other, you could turn off the lights or cause the banking system to wobble or whatever your objective might be in the context of war. But the threat to this country that I most worry about, these tools in the hands of extremists, and then left unchecked, the bleeding of intellectual capital over a long period of time.
Governor, should Jay be turning about at night out of fear of a cyber attack or cyber vulnerability?
Well, I hope Jay is alert and aware and concerned. I don't know that we want to tell people to stay awake all night over this or any other issue. Part of the group that I run is a think tank and advocacy group called BITS, which is focused just on cybersecurity issues. And this has been described broadly, the economic espionage, as the greatest theft of technology and wealth in human history. So the examples are replete. They're now public in many instances, but whether it is the Chinese having access to the drone technology or F-35 fighter plane technology, whether it's the hospital in Georgia, and this actually happened, where people were able to penetrate the system and literally shut down a hospital to the point where they had to turn away incoming patients because their systems were compromised and non-functioning, whether it's the so-called DDoS or distributed denial of service attacks, which are now weekly being visited upon the financial institutions of our country. The list goes on and on and on. But the point is, this is a very significant threat. It is accelerating. The magnitude of it is large, and the consequences are serious. And the American public and our policymakers and industry need to work together to make sure we're doing everything we can to prevent and mitigate the loss and the damage.
Kevin, could I just add a comment, a little context here? Our laws and our process and Sarbanes-Oxley and public companies and all the things that frame us as the institutions we serve or participate in are designed in a way that a business that's been penetrated is not incentivized, as a matter of fact, is punished for revealing the fact that they've been compromised. So if you've got a service or a manufactured good or whatever it is, and you've been penetrated, one, that's going to go off to another country and probably be produced more cheaply and compete. But the fact you were penetrated may set you up for litigation, from stockholders or other interested parties. So our system for dealing with this is very complex, and it incentivizes behavior in the wrong direction as opposed to, in my view, the correct direction, where we can share the information and get ahead of the problem.
So I want to talk about some of the policy solutions to issues like that, but dig in a little bit more first about who the primary actors are of some of these threats. So you laid out at a high level really nicely. You have the nations who are effectively preparing for cyber war. You have the disgruntled people in any organization. And you also have the economic espionage. Who are the individuals or organizations who are literally instigating this malware that's infecting every organization of significant size in the U.S.?
All right, first of all, let's talk about cyber warfare. And if on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to talk about the ones at the top. Who would be the best at cyber warfare? We're mad at someone, they're mad at us, we want to turn off their water, their power, whatever, their air defense system, whatever. The best in the world, United States, Great Britain, the Russians, the French, the Israelis. On a scale of 1 to 10, most of those are either 10s or really close. Now, when you go beyond that, you start to fall off that scale. Chinese, 7, 7.5. So in terms of capability, I've described the ones that are most capable in a warfare context. Now let me describe the ones that are most prolific in doing economic espionage. Our estimate is about 85 to 90% of the activity is being carried out by the Chinese. Why? Well, if you think about China for a second, at 1.3 billion people, about half live below the Chinese poverty line, and they must grow. So as a public policy, they must find ways to grow. And one of the things they've decided is, let's go to this source of intellectual property, intellectual capital, innovation, that's there for free. There are examples of U.S. companies investing literally hundreds of millions, if not billions, and losing all of that research and development in less than a week. Amazingly, a company in China started to produce the product.
And so there's been focus in terms of China specifically on universities, military installations where some of the attacks have been traced back to. Is that your...
Well, let me size it for you. In the military, there are over 100,000 people that do this every day. There are probably an equal number in the civilian side of government and academia.
And is that specifically cyber economic espionage or more broadly?
The military does both. They want to also capture war planning, technical design of an airplane or a submarine or something of that nature. The civilian side and the academic side and the business side would be more after intellectual property. So I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 people a day spend their day doing this. Now, let me size that so you understand it on the U.S. side. In the entire U.S. intelligence community, Army, Navy, Air Force, CIA, NSA, all the players, there are a total of 100,000 people. And the vast majority of those are not doing electronic warfare or electronic surveillance.
Mm-hmm. Governor, do you want to talk about the threats in the financial services industry in particular and who the attackers are,
Sure.
who the...
And again, this is all relative. So if you think of the private sector companies who's most accustomed to dealing with these threats and building up some expertise and some resiliency around it, the financial service sector has been a target and has been dealing with this somewhat longer than many other sectors. So they're a little more seasoned, have been a little more targeted in terms of the opponents coming after them, and are probably better positioned than some other sectors. Keep in mind, and the Admiral knows this, but the very best people in the whole country, namely the Department of Defense and related entities, have had their most sensitive secrets stolen, in some cases by cyber attacks, and it's a matter of public record. So that goes to your friend Jay. Should he worry? Well, if you got the very best at the very top guarding the most precious information, and that got taken, then you know we've got some issues. But that being said, the financial service sector is in relatively better shape than perhaps some of the others, but they're under attack. So every week there's distributed denial of service attacks are occurring. They take the form of actors trying to slow up, gunk up, frustrate the user experience at the website or app level. They are annoying, they are frustrating, they're inefficient, but they haven't yet migrated to the point where somebody's been able to pull off a large-scale cyber bank robbery.
What is the motivation for those attacks? Is it
money or strategic defects? So you've got here's the type of actors. It could range from, still struggling with acne teenagers who are having fun in their mom and dad's basement, goofing around as hackers. It could be Ukrainian mobsters. It could be state-sponsored or semi-state-sponsored entities who are probing defenses to set it up for a next layer or more complicated attack later down the road. And their motives could simply be money, like the folks who took $45 million out of a kind of a ham-fisted ATM deal a couple months ago. Or it could be folks who have much more mischievous and much more strategic designs in mind.
Let me offer just a comment, a context. I've been focused on this for so many years. When I went to the National Security Agency as new director in the early 90s, I was struggling with Cold War's over and the world's changing and the internet's been created and how are we going to be focused. So I really have worried about the problem. Now let me go to banking. First of all, financial services are the best in the private sector. They're the best. Why? They got money and that's what criminals want, so they target it, so they're kind of forced to address the issue. That said, the U.S. economy is $16 trillion a year, $16 trillion a year. In the banking system, and my view is the world will not work without banks, a unit of measure into which people have confidence. That's what facilitates the flow of goods and services and trading and so on. In the global banking system, $13 trillion a day is cleared. Now, capture those numbers. Our economy, largest in the world, largest in the history of the world, $16 trillion a year, and $13 trillion a day flows through the system. One bank clears half of that money. So now if I'm really good...
And that bank is?
One bank clears half of that money.
I think that's
I mean,
I think that's Googleable.
Well, but
Everybody
I'm claimed. It is claimed that I'm helping the terrorists understand what the target. I don't want to get too specific, but if I were a terrorist and I had some of these advanced tools that would allow me to change every 15th zero to a 1, it would slowly contaminate the system. And I have every confidence if you can't clear at the speed of light, banking stops. So if I were a terrorist, that's what I would target.
You can stay up at night thinking about various scenarios, but I'll give you one hypothetical. What if somebody was able to access systems and take not $40 million, but $50 billion? And they did it not over 2 weeks, but in 2 seconds. And they not only took it, but then they had the systems in place and programs in place to respend that money 15 times over in 2 more seconds. So your money or somebody's money is taken, spent, respent. You know, it goes to Amazon, to Target, to Gander Mountain, to some vendor in France and around the world. So by the time this is even acknowledged or noticed, you could have a lot of damage. So the difference here is in some cases, even with a missile attack, you've got some amount of time to say there's an attack, it's originated from a certain geographic zone, we have some reason to believe it was either state-sponsored or not, we have some ability for human interaction and discussion to decide what we might do in terms of defenses or countermeasures. But the types of attacks that could come in the future could happen in milliseconds. And so how do you address, on a preventative basis, things that can happen at network speed while still wanting to involve human judgment and human discretion? It's a very interesting question, and one that you have to sort of decide ahead of time what the parameters are, and not to get into the weeds too much, but a lot of these attacks, let's say hypothetically somebody originated or something appeared to originate in Iran, but the technology pipeline went through Tajikistan to Canada to Buffalo, New York. As you trace that all back and it goes through Canada and you're, not the private sector, but the government, if you're going to launch a countermeasure, you better be sure, and this has got to be done quickly, there's a lot of friendly territory between the chain of events that I just described, including other nations, their pipelines, their capabilities, innocent, technology bystanders. So this raises a whole series of next generation policy issues that are not yet being fully joined.
So what?
Can I just, again, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I want to add one other comment for context. In the military, when you teach, you have a bunch of troops out there and you're trying to teach something, you get to a point you call foot stomper. A foot stomper means when I'm stomping my foot, that's the question on the test, write it down. Because when I test you, you're going to have to give me back that answer. But I want to accentuate what Governor Pawlenty just said, speed. It's 30 milliseconds from Tokyo to New York. Now, most people don't think in terms of milliseconds. 30 milliseconds. That's 31 thousandths of a second. You can go around the globe. You can clear a whole banking transaction around the globe in less than a second. So how we have to think about this is in terms of network speed. When you say network speed, that is the speed of light, 18,000 miles per second.
So there are 2 parts of that network speed that I want to talk about specifically, and then we'll start focusing more on the possible solutions, because at this point I'm not going to be sleeping for any nights anytime soon. But speed is the first one, and Governor Pawlenty, you said that raises a bunch of policy questions. Could you just list a few of the policy questions that are related to
Well,
that?
let's say that somebody has to make a decision about the defense and potential countermeasures. Let's even elevate it to the public realm, not the private realm, because we're not authorized legally, obviously, to launch countermeasures into foreign territories. But and it's going to all happen in less than a second. And you're going to have to pre-automate some of the decision making, or at least pre-program some of the options.
Yeah.
You got to start thinking about, do we have certainty around the geographic point of origin, or is it a disguised point of origin? Do we have a handle on whether the originators are rogue or whether they're state-sponsored? Do we have a handle that the other places and people in the chain of events are just being used, or were they complicit in the deal? You've got to be able to assess the damage. So there's a lot of those issues. I will say, another issue is just on the information sharing. You'll hear this when we get into the solution side of the discussion. The Admiral touched on this a minute ago, but Of course, banks and other entities have competitive concerns. If you have a piece of technology architecture and it's been compromised and you turn it over to the government, a number of things get raised as a policy issue. One is that going to be public information under the Freedom of Information Act? So now the public and the press gets to see your architecture and your competitors and future hackers. Two is, once the government gets a hold of it, are they going to sanction you? Three is, once the trial lawyers get a hold of it, are they going to sue you for some sort of negligence in developing and maintaining your system? Next is, if that transfer has any sort of personal information or privacy concerns attached to it, who else is going to get mad and sue you and get you in legal trouble? So there's a whole cluster of what can the private sector share with the government, what can the government share with the private sector, what can the private sector share with each other, all in an effort to be better informed, better educated, quicker, faster, more effective in all of this. And that's why this legislation is important.
And we'll get to that a little bit.
What the governor described, the front end of what he described?
Yeah.
How do you know? Who's responsible? What's going on? That's the mission of the community that I was privileged to lead.
Yeah.
We're supposed to know that. And now here's the dilemma. If we capture it and we know about it and we know its signature and its profile and it's never been used, never been seen out there, and we have that, it's classified in a very compartmented way. Why shouldn't we share that with corporate America? That's the dilemma. We live today under rules that were established in World War II and served us well in the Cold War. But we have not yet been forced to change those rules to protect the country. Remember, the mission of the United States intelligence community is to protect the United States.
Yeah. So you're credited with actually building up the U.S. capabilities around combating cyber threats. How would you assess today our state of readiness and focus as a country on those issues?
On a scale of 1 to 10, exploitation, reading the other guy's mail, we're a 10. On the scale of hurting someone offensively, turning off their air defense, we're an 8, but no one else is much better. On a scale of defending the country, I'd give us a 4 at best.
Why 4? Why so low?
Because we have not yet matured fully on this. Now, most of the research and the tool development and the thinking and the preparation has been perimeter defense. Mm-hmm. We spend a lot of money on that. We're pretty good at it. We're not perfect. And there are elements that do it very well. The Department of Defense does it well. They call it .mil because we're riding in the same public switch network. Most people are surprised to learn that government classified information, business proprietary information, your personal information, your grandmother's fruitcake recipe, it's all in the same glass pipe. Mm-hmm. So what the Department of Defense did was create what they call .mil, and it's more protected. They encrypt and they move to it that way. So there are elements in society that have made themselves more protected. But .com, which is what 90% of what's out there, owned and operated by the private sector, it's wild, wild west. It's wide open.
I want to focus on this issue of network for a second. And in the financial institution, you have big organizations which have resources and experiences dealing with the sort of attacks that you described. But there are second, third, fourth tier institutions which are just as equally wired into the global financial system and probably a lot more vulnerable or unprepared for that sort of attack. Is that something that you're focused on?
Yes, so the financial services industry, whether it's big, medium, or small, is focused on this. And I will say the awareness and concern around these issues has risen dramatically in recent years. If you went back 3, 4, 5, 7 years ago, it was kind of a CIO-only kind of discussion. Now the CEOs and the leadership of most companies are eyes wide open and leaning into this hard. But most of these institutions are interconnected. So, if you had, for example, a modest-sized bank that got compromised and somebody could use that as a portal, say, into the Treasury, which could then be used as a portal to other places, it's not just, the one. Similarly, everybody focuses on financial institutions, but what if somebody was able to get a hold of the food distribution network, shut down grocery stores because their checkout functions are all electronic and their order functions and distribution functions are electronic, or a cheese plant, you think, well, how mission critical is a cheese plant? Somebody was telling me the other day, you've got a mechanized automated program for how much of this and how much of that goes into a cheese product. Well, if you juice up the injection of a certain enzyme into the cheese, it becomes a toxic substance. So those are the kinds of scenarios you can get into, and it is almost unlimited what you can come up with. I don't think we should freak out, but it is something that, as a country, we need to be vigilant about and forward-leaning on it.
So we move to deadly cheddar cheese.
Yeah,
here.
the cheddar monster is coming to get you.
So I think it's time. We're adequately scared.
Kevin, I need to finish that thought on all of our thinking has been perimeter defense.
Yep.
The real threat's going to be insider. An insider is either going to be a bad actor inside or somebody outside becomes an insider. And so you'll see more and more focus on access controls, identity management. Yep. Those are the things that are very immature that as a nation and as an industry we're going to have to build out and make much more mature.
So let's focus on the solutions, and I just want to take you each in turn because I know you've both thought a lot about what the key elements of increasing American defense preparedness for these issues is. So would you like to start?
Well, I'm a product of the U.S. Navy for 30 years, and in that I had a chance to participate in sort of crisis du jour, wherever we were, whatever was going on, from burning embassies to saving babies in Somalia or volcano rescue, whatever. And so I got to observe bureaucratic behavior. And anytime you have large bureaucracies that have missions that overlap or touch, you have a lot of friction and you have very low level of cooperation. So what I've framed in my mind, because let me use the government side. There's Title 10, that's Department of Defense. There's Title 50, that's my community, the intel community. There's Title 6, that's a Homeland Security community. There's Title 18, that's law enforcement, and there, it goes on and on. Homeland Security, 78 oversight committees. Now how, in the name of goodness, are you going to get the chairman of 78 oversight committees to collaboratively coordinate with the oversight of defense to put this together in a comprehensive way? Now let me go back to the speed. NSA's got the answer. DHS is in charge. FBI wants to open a law enforcement case. How do you move through that at the speed necessary for us to solve this problem? So my view is we must have a comprehensive legislative framework that's going to allow us to do this. And I have 4 points in the framework. First, information sharing must be required. Government to industry, industry to government, industry to industry. Second, if industry shares, they must have the incentive to have liability protection for the sharing. You got to protect them if they're going to share. The third thing we're going to have to address is some level of standard. I would describe it as an outcome, not a specific, of where we want the critical infrastructures to be protected. And the fourth thing is you must address the privacy and civil liberties concerns. I'm a spy. Everybody loves to go to the spy movies and read the books, but we're not welcome at the dinner table. Just the way it works. People get a little uncomfortable with spies. So you have to put in the law what the spies are allowed to do so that it is enforced in the context of the law. It is audited and warranted and investigated by the Congress, the Department of Justice, the judicial branch, and then wherever the agency exists, in a way that the American people have confidence that it's not being abused.
So spies, as you say, have a sort of complicated history in the United States.
Right.
The last few weeks have been particularly difficult for that community because, as we all have been following, the Edward Snowden leaking some information around U.S. government surveillance, former Booz Allen employee, unfortunately. Does this legislative framework that you're talking about and this debate around what we need to do instantly, individual rights, privacy, how that ties into it, does that discussion become more complicated because of the national debate that's still very raw and emerging around some of these issues?
Last year there were 14 bills and amendments introduced on the Hill, and they all failed for a variety of disagreement over too much regulation or not enough concern about privacy or whatever. So we're trying it again this year. The House has already passed their bill. It addresses two things: information sharing to the private sector and from the private sector, and liability protection. It doesn't address the privacy issues, and it doesn't address any outcomes in terms of raising protection of critical infrastructure. So with this most recent event, my belief is we tend to react and overreact. If you'll remember, after 9/11, we had a commission called the 9/11 Commission. My community was judged to have failed for lack of imagination and the inability to share information and failure to connect the dots. So we spent the last 10 years sharing information and connecting the dots and making it all available, and 2 events have happened. Bradley Manning, assuming he's guilty as charged, and he's compromised a lot of information, and this most recent actor, where an insider, because the system was designed to share, took advantage of that. So now what we as a nation have to do is make a judgment about what changes do we need to make and how do we adapt to it, because we have to address the problem. We can't ignore it. One of the things that General Alexander has proposed is for a systems administrator, like this most recent leaker, anytime he's having the level of access he enjoyed, it's 2-man, or I should say 2-person control. You can't do it alone. You have to have a partner.
Someone physically present with you when you're doing that.
For example, if you're going to open a system and take something out, 2 keys.
Yeah.
One person can't do it unless the other, and then you actually see it.
So there is a lot of discussion around this issue. Is there a structure for talking about how to weigh these? You know, what you've said is that there needs to be a national discussion about this issue. It sounds like there's some practical ideas. The national discussion is relatively fluid at this point.
It's a big discussion, especially in the wake of the recent events. But you know, the U.S. House addressed some of these issues that the Admiral just listed. And by the way, his 4-point framework, I think, is spot on. But in the Senate, of course, the debate is hung up, and it's hung up for 2 main reasons. One is there's a group of civil libertarians, both on the right and the left, who are very concerned about privacy issues. And then you have elements of the business community, not the financial service sector, but elements of the business community saying, wait a minute, I don't think I want government coming in and imposing standards and putting requirements and mandates and telling me what to do technologically. And then, of course, you have the recent events with Snowden and the aftermath kind of casting a wet blanket over all of that. So it's hung up in the Senate, but you do have policymakers at senior levels debating these issues, you know, essentially as we speak.
When I went back into government in 2007, one of the reasons I chose to do that, because there was some personal penalty for going back in, because I was in a different position at that time. So anyway, I went in, but one of the reasons was I could put cybersecurity, because I thought it was important, back on the national agenda. And I was surprised it didn't take very long. Then it was, okay, Mike, I got it. This is the President speaking. You brought the problem in here. Let's figure out what we're going to do about it. And you go up on the Hill and talk to them and describe the problem. Now, think first of all, what's the average age in the Senate? And when you start talking about computers, the default is, well, you know, if you're going to talk about computers, I need to get my grandchildren in here. Yeah. And then one of them actually said to me, you know, that little green light on my VCR is still blinking, and I still don't know how to turn it off. So this is a complex problem. It's pretty easy to talk to a 25-year-old about it.
Yeah.
It's more of a challenge to talk to people who just aren't as comfortable with it. So you asked, do we have a framework? Hey, this is a democracy. Do we have a framework?
There it is.
It's a pickup game. You know, we'll work it out when we...
Think of the complexity, though, of it and the moving piece. If you have an iPhone, you want to conduct a transaction on your iPhone, it's not just what's the system or the architecture of a company or an enterprise. You know, if you conduct a transaction, you have the iPhone itself, or, you know, the Droid equivalent. You have all of the component parts in there that have been manufactured perhaps in different parts of the world by different people with all kinds of teams and personnel involved in that. Then you have to have an internet service provider to get your cell service and your signal. So there's a whole series of people and events and technology involved in that. If you want to switch over to Wi-Fi, there's a whole series of technology and people that have set that up and at least electronically are involved in that. If you walk down the street and you switch from one Wi-Fi to another, that switches it again. And then you start interacting with the provider, the vendor, let's say through an app. So you got a bunch of people who designed an app. They may have subcontractors who have a piece of the app, either technologically or otherwise, and be involved in real time. Then behind that, you've got the provider of the good or service or product who's got their own architecture and system that's been designed with their people involved and other people involved. And so there are dozens, if not hundreds, of physical or technological or virtual component parts in a series of events, any one of which could prevent an area of exposure or a place where somebody could potentially intervene and cause problems.
So you're scaring us again.
So
just one quick thing. We're going to take questions from the audience in a few minutes, and we'll pass around a microphone. So if you have a question, you can start thinking of it, and I'll I'll let you know in a few minutes when we're ready for that.
I want to build on this point. I said earlier the nation's not comfortable with spies. If you'll think about it, we've never been prepared for war. Yeah. Because after we get started, we need it, we build it, and then the first thing we do is let's get rid of those guys. So we went into World War II totally unprepared. What little bit we had was arguing with each other about who was in charge. My example is Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor should never have happened, and I feel very strongly about it. And I read all the books, and I don't believe any of them. Roosevelt did not know ahead of time. We should have prevented it. So why do I feel so strongly about that? If you'll think about it, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, we took a crippled naval force and defeated the largest maritime armada in history at the Battle of Midway. Why? Because we were reading their code. We knew exactly where they were going, what they were doing. We knew exactly how to attack. We defeated them in the war turned in the Pacific. If we had started focused on reading that code 6 months before Pearl Harbor wouldn't have happened. So now the point I'm making is the nation doesn't like spies very much. But when we faced the Cold War, we said, well, all right, we got to have a group that can do this. And we built a fairly robust capability. Now, to make the governor's point, those of us that did this for a living, our job was to spy on the Soviet Union. Every way we could penetrate the Soviet Union, we penetrated the Soviet Union. A piece of equipment, a telephone, anything we could get in there that would be friendly to us. And so nation states today, when they're building apps or laptops or whatever they're doing, is for competitive information advantage, for competitive advantage, or for wartime advantage. That's the way the world works.
You started getting into them earlier, but can you give us if you had a few things that you'd want everyone to focus on, policy issues presumably, what would they be?
Well, one is, the Admiral mentioned this earlier, is if you can narrow the scope of the pipe, if you will. He mentioned .mil. There's an opportunity that's unfolding through, we have an affiliated group to do .bank or .insurance. So if you have greater control over the pipeline and its scope, you can introduce some more control from a security standpoint of who has access to it, for what circumstances, under what conditions. That's not a total solution, but it may be very helpful, and it's in development and something that I think should be available in the coming years. And as to going back to the policy piece, the ability to share information across private sector entities, private sector entity to government, government to the private sector, is vitally important. And it is not an easy set of issues for all of the reasons that are clear in the public debate post-Snowden, which is who gets what. Let's say a company has a suspicious reason to believe something's afoot, and it involves an email. Well, is it the email? Does the IP address, is that transferable? Is the content line transferable? Is the email address transferable? Is the attachment that contains the malware transferable? Is the content of the email under certain circumstances readable? Again, all interesting questions, but as we sit here today, an area where the law is unsettled and unresolved.
And where speed is
absolutely critical.
Exactly.
And you don't have 2 weeks to go get pleadings and take it to the, and file a legal case.
If you were to Google my name, you'll find a phrase in there published by Wired magazine that says that I'm the epitome of corporate sleaze, and that I'm the only real threat to the internet. And the case they're making is maintaining anonymity.
I'm surprised that you advertised that.
Oh no, it's part, it goes with the territory. People focus on privacy and anonymity, and the case I'm making is not to get rid of anonymity. I think social media is going to change the world. I think if China is going to be democratic, it's going to be because social media. The Arab Spring, I believe, was a good thing.
Yeah.
So what I'm arguing for, and what the governor just described, is a level of ability to communicate among critical infrastructures where you are required to give up anonymity because you want authentication. If you've got two operators running trains up and down the East Coast at 100 miles an hour, don't you want to know who the heck they are?
Yeah.
And that they are who they say they are?
Yeah.
So when you're moving billions of dollars or you're moving classified information, think critical infrastructure. The primary ones are money, electric power, transportation, telecommunications. It's my belief that for maintaining that, because it impacts so many citizens, we should require whoever's sitting at that computer to give up to authenticate, give up their anonymity, so that you get the artifacts of good security. Now, you can still run the internet and do social media like it runs today. So I'm not the enemy of the internet. Just wanted to clarify that.
Okay, that's noted in the official record of Aspen Ideas Festival. And part of, just to go back to the information sharing also, it's about, what you're talking about is about banks being able, in the heat of an attack, to be able to share potentially client information with each other that is involved in the attack, or as you brought up earlier, or U.S. government agencies being able to communicate details of.
Well, it may not even be, and perhaps wouldn't be client information, but let's say Bank A has information that is, and the person who has it is got a security classification. They're under attack, and his colleague over at Bank B is about to experience the same thing, or this person has reason to believe he could help in Bank B. But if the right clearance isn't in place, obviously for good reason, at the right level, you know, the ability to share that information is potentially a violation of law. So again, the legislation has to envision ahead of time who gets what clearances, for what reason, under what circumstances can and should information be shared, and even cross-company, and even within a company. You know, so you got a CIO who's got classified information, bank or entity's under threat, and let's say the CEO doesn't have the right clearance, or the CEO's out of the country and the COO's in charge, and he or she doesn't have the right clearance. So there's a bunch of issues like that. It gets fairly tactical, but those are the kinds of things that matter in a crisis.
When I went back in, I was a fairly busy guy. I mean, my consumer wanted a brief every day at 7:30, so my day started at 4 in the morning. But so I had a bunch of things to do, and we sort of worked those off. If I did it again today, I would start a dialogue on changing the classification rules, just fundamentally rethinking the way we classify information. I think it's way overclassified. Yeah. And now at some level, you're going to have some information that's protected, but I think we could rethink the whole framework so we could address these issues, particularly if it's in the critical infrastructure.
Is that a live discussion at this point, or no?
No. Because of the most recent event, we're going in the other direction right now. But you know, it's a pendulum, and you know, we never stop at equilibrium. We're always.
You may get another shot at it too.
Well, in less than 30 days, I'll be 70 years old, and I'm going to fold my tent and watch Governor Pawlenty solve this problem.
So we're going to go to questions now. I'd ask you to raise your hand if you have a question. And also, when you ask your question, if you can just say your name first. So the first question is back there. We'll bring you a microphone. If you can wait for the microphone to speak. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. This is a question in terms of the role of business in protecting our assets. The Fortune 500, which account for our industrial assets, and whether it's food, transportation, financial systems, or utilities, opposed, I believe, in the last year, an attempt by the administration to require defensive cyber networks to be put in place. This goes beyond sharing information. Sharing information is after the fact. Defenses are ideally before the fact. What is the role of the private sector, in terms of, let's talk the Fortune 500, in yielding to national security and not having the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce, fighting this? I mean, this seems to be more important than regulating tobacco or soft drinks.
You're representing private sector.
Yeah, I should mention the financial service part of that is different than some other parts of the business community more broadly, because like I said earlier, we're more familiar with dealing with regulation, dealing with oversight, even in the technology area. So we have been supportive of the House and various versions of the Senate bill as well. I don't want to speak for those other groups because they have their own voices, but I think their general concern is this, some of them. We really don't think the government coming in and telling us what standards are is a good idea, because mostly they're behind where we would be in terms of technology, capability, functionality, bureaucracy. Number two, they want to be careful about what gets defined as critical versus non-critical, and some clarity around that. And they want to have a debate about how specific the mandate might be coming from government. Is it a standard for an outcome, or is it a particular, architecture? Let's say you're running your system on, Oracle database, and somebody wants you to impose a Microsoft solution, or the standards are written in a way that get into the weeds of it more than many companies are comfortable with. Again, for our my organization is supportive of the legislation, but other businesses have had some reservations. They understand the problem and the concern, but they have had some reservations. And as importantly, don't forget about the privacy advocates. I mean, they are as powerful or more powerful in this debate than the business interests.
The analogy for me is when I think about government's role in forcing safety, food safety or highway safety. If you left that to industry, there's not a business case for it, so there's tension between the two. And my way I think about it, this is so important to us. There has to be some pressure from government, and then getting that balance. I understand the burden of regulation when it doesn't make sense. I mean, I fully appreciate that, but some forcing function to cause a dialogue to happen so that the cybersecurity posture, and I keep saying critical infrastructures, that's the things that sustain us. At a minimum, that has to be protected at a higher level.
May I take a question over here in the front?
Thank you. Stephen Kaufman from Houston. Admiral McConnell, you said we've been stealing from each other for years, and during the Cold War we took from the Russians and they took from us, and it wasn't considered an act of war. And presumably the Chinese stealing both our military and even more seriously intellectual business property isn't an act of war. And again, presumably, were we to engage in some surgical cyber attack against them would be paralyzing a small bank or something. Is there, in this uneven relationship with China where they want to steal and they don't have anything we particularly want to steal in intellectual property, is there any advanced conversation going on to create rules of the road between our two countries? And as perhaps a threat to encourage that, are we considering the threat of cyber attack to counterattack theft?
There's been a lot of motion in the past 18 months, 2 years, a lot of dialogue about addressing that. The President signed out a classified presidential decision directive to put our rules in place. So it's classified, and I won't say more about it other than that if you want a decision to do something offensively, you don't do it without the President's approval. In my view, and I'm reading just what I'm not in the inside, I'm just reading the newspaper, the President meeting with the Chinese President some weeks ago, this was a primary discussion topic, and the subject was going to be, look, we both know that we have to understand each other's military capability. The ability to deliver nuclear weapons, missiles, airplanes, ships, carriers, whatever it is. That is an expected product of us keeping each other honest. But what you do, China, that we don't do is this intellectual property. Now, you'll notice the timing of the event that we discussed earlier was just before that meeting. So every engagement with the Chinese, and I've had it myself in my previous role, is denial. We're embarrassed that you raised the issue. It is against Chinese law, and we don't do it. And that's as far as the dialogue has progressed to this point. I would agree with what you said. At some point, nation states who must trade, realizing the value of this global information technology transfer system, the ability to communicate at the speed of light, we're going to have to respect the integrity of that process for business and trading. That said, we're still going to make sure we keep the other side honest on how many missiles or how many nuclear weapons or whatever.
Take a question over here in way back.
Mike, you quoted the speed of light. How is a task force or your workers ever going to compete, or the government compete with that speed as a person or knowledgeable entity at all?
So say the last part of it.
Just an entity, knowledgeable workforce. How are you going to compete with the speed of light of the internet when criminals can come in? How is a knowledgeable person like me, are you going to compete against that?
Well, one of the challenges is seeing the net. And if you ask most people how many networks are there, the answer will be thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. If you ask the nation's code breaker, there's one. So if you can see it and you can do your reconnaissance ahead of time so you understand it, then it allows you to at least to be dynamic in your response. So you could actually take action to block or parry before the adversary moved.
I understand that. How quickly for the financial, for you, Tim, how quickly is applications being set up, and are they different for the common banker compared to, say, a U.S. trust compared to a Bank of America? Is there different applications for those people compared to the common banker?
This is an evolving issue, and one that the banks and other institutions are radically, massively investing in and getting better and faster each week, each month, each year. And they don't follow necessarily a common architecture or a common protocol, so the practices vary. But I think it's fair to say they are, in the private sector space, the best compared to other sectors. But it's a work in progress, and they are the best, but even the best could be vulnerable under certain circumstances. But it is a big difference from, say, 5 or 10 years ago. This is a CEO level imperative and priority now. They're putting big resources against it, and they've got a lot of talent, and the industry sharing with each other. Even if you're a mid-size or smaller institution, you get the benefit, getting back to information sharing, of getting the expertise and hopefully early warning insight from some of your peer groups and your colleagues who are able to share.
An observation I would make, just for clarity here, what I've studied historically and what I've participated in personally, information is generated in a variety of ways. You can have a source of intelligence or a different source of intelligence or a business community, whatever. And there's a way to think about this as knowledge is power, and you want to contain or restrict or hold the information. So it's very hard to get people to share the information. When we've had a national problem we had to solve, when we had to solve the Battle of Midway, we put all the information in one place and we worked it in a very dynamic fashion. Now, I personally have participated in that in a Cold War event where we had to solve a tough problem. I would say bringing Osama bin Laden to justice. We flailed around for a long time looking at individual piece parts, and we finally put it in one place where we could look at everything at one time. We figured out a way to solve the problem. So some of this is going to be, how does the banking community, the telecommunications community, whichever community, how do they really share it at what I call an all-source level, so that they are, in fact, informed by the best information at the highest rate of speed.
Take a question over here on the aisle.
Greg Feldman, I have a question for the Admiral. I was fascinated by the Stuxnet attacks on Iran a few years ago, and I just wondered if you could comment on the vulnerability of rogue states or enemy states to cyber warfare on our part.
How vulnerable are rogue states to cyber warfare? They are very vulnerable. I mean, part of what I worry about in terms of what someone can do to us is because I have a pretty good understanding of what we can do going the other way. So on a scale of offense, I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, the best is an 8, and that's us. There are others that are close, but we could do some pretty significant damage if we chose to do it.
Just to follow on that, is there a reason that we don't deploy it more often, or does the public just not know about it?
Secondary.
There's some hotspots around the world where you
tertiary. Well, let's say you take an action, then we're more we depend on this stuff more than anyone else. We're more vulnerable than anybody else in the world. If we could put a map up here of the world, the U.S. on center, and then we put bandwidth on top of it, it's a bell curve. Most of the communications in the world flow through the United States, and we are the biggest user and beneficiary. So there's a great hesitancy to use anything in a cyber context because it's relatively easy to punch back in a pretty aggressive way. So every discussion I've ever participated in is, you got some options, well, let's just hold those aside and consider other options. But we could do major damage. We also, if you haven't followed it, the U.S. government created U.S. Cyber Command. Its purpose is twofold, offense and defense. And the offense will get a lot of attention.
We'll take a few more questions right over here in the aisle.
I was wondering, based on the age of our power grid, how vulnerable are we and what is being done in that regard?
At one level, the age of it is an advantage. It's a little bit like me. But it is increasingly vulnerable. I sat with Secretary Schlesinger at one of these conferences where we were talking about the subject. And he, remember, former Director of CIA, former Secretary of Defense, former Secretary of Energy. And Secretary Schlesinger said smart grid is a recipe for disaster. Now, if you talk to the people that are benefiting from it in terms of energy efficiency, it's marvelous. I mean, it's incredible what it's doing for us. But it is also a way that an adversary could do some pretty incredible things. So vulnerable will become more vulnerable, and that industry is now starting to do things to reduce that vulnerability.
A question from this side? We have time for one or two more questions.
I'm Bob Taylor from San Francisco. The Stuxnet question raised a sort of a follow-on question in my mind. I'm wondering whether we do anything systematic to screen software that is brought into the United States from outside. It's widely believed that the Stuxnet worm was embedded in software commercially acquired by the Iranian government. So I'm wondering how vulnerable we are to that and what we're doing about it.
Not only is the software not vetted and verified, the globe produces software that is not produced at a level of standard to make it secure and robust. That's one of the major issues. There's a big debate about how to do that, and there's a debate about corporations doing it with a service or open source. So this is going to go on for some time before we get some rules of the road. But to answer your question, what comes in is not verified or vetted.
I'm going to take one last question over here. We're just about out of time.
Admiral, in a recent public conversation with Dick Clark, the former head of the NSA, he suggested, because of the tertiary effects that you suggest, that we have the following dialogue with China. You're a member of the, and I'd like you to comment on it. You're a member of the WTO, very important for you economically and prestige-wise. People in the WTO don't do the stuff you're doing. Either stop it or I'll make sure you're not in the WTO. Do you think that's effective? Do you think it's realistic?
That discussion has been conducted. I was in the government for a while. I participated in that discussion myself. I was a pretty strong advocate of that point of view. But we're not there yet. And I think this is just a matter of time. When corporate America gets to the point where they realize what they've lost. Now, right now, they're punished for sharing it. They're punished for making it public. Guys like me keep being an annoyance and a pain in the tush to get it out there. When we start to understand the significance of that threat, then we'll make that point. And I would argue that at some point, it's not in China's interest to do this, because at some point they're going to have technology they don't want to have exploited.
I know we got to close out, but you're negotiating with an entity that thinks cheating is okay. You know, in their leadership decision-making ethic, we have made the decision it's not okay for us to conduct economic espionage. They don't follow that same rule. And unless and until they have a consequence or an incentive or a change of heart, they won't. And I think the day will come where either we turn the leverage on them or they have enough of their own at risk, their own intellectual property at risk, where they do it themselves. But right now you're negotiating with somebody who will tell you flat out they don't do it. That's not true. And they cheat, and they think that's okay.
They passed a formal program in 1986. It's called Program 863. They tend to name a program that's formal after the year and the month, so it was March of '86. And it basically says leapfrog, and now what does that mean? We will acquire innovation, technology, research and development in any way possible to our advantage. A spy, through cyber means, through a joint venture, and if you look at the laws and the way even joint ventures are set up, you must share your technology. And amazingly, after you have a very productive business for a year or two, maybe 3, maybe 4, all of a sudden you got problems, you're going out of business, and there's something down the road.
Well, the old joke, if you're a company in the industry, if you're going to do business in China and have a facility there and you've got intellectual property that you need to protect, the only way to really do it is to get a Chinese partner who's connected to the Chinese government, because then they're protecting partially their own interests, and that's about the only way you can stop it.
So we're just about out of time. I want to ask one last question, because you have both scared us sufficiently. As an American citizen, as an individual, what can we do? And I mean, seriously, are we, because of the risk of disruption, should we have 10 days supply worth of cash? Should we have 2 weeks worth of food available? Should we unplug our computers from the internet at night?
Yeah, I would say 2 things. Good cyber hygiene will solve about 85% of the problem. So do that. The most important thing you can do is call your representative or your senator and tell them you're serious, you want this problem addressed. We will not solve this problem without a legal framework that requires the entities to cooperate. My model for that, I grew up in the Department of Defense. We all fought each other. There's a bill called Goldwater-Nichols. It did two things. It required us to do jointness, and it said if you're going to be promoted, you want to be an Admiral General, you can't do it unless you have joint qualifications. Totally changed the DOD. We need that for this set of players.
And on the first question, cyber hygiene, you mean running antivirus software
Sure,
and
yeah,
all the
basic
things that
hygiene things,
okay.
right?
Yeah,
Government
I would embrace that. And you know, in the private sector, a lot of the economic espionage is, not all of it, but a result of sloppy practices.
Mm-hmm.
And a big chunk of that can be cured. And number two, tell legislators and policymakers that we need cyber legislation, reasonable, you know, but it has to be done, and we're behind.
As the nation's code breaker, I will tell you most of our success in reading the other guy's mail is the other guy's mistake. So just good hygiene.
Good passwords, solid passwords.
Good passwords. If everybody here gave me their resume, I could recapture half the resumes by the time you get to the next 10. I could recapture half the passwords by the time you get to the next 10. We don't take it seriously.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you both. That was a great, thoughtful discussion.